This is a love story that takes place in a small city called the Queen of the Shenandoah, Staunton, Virginia, distinguished by its Victorian architecture. In the middle of the city is Gypsy Hill Park with its distinguished bandstand. Every Monday evening during the summer, the Stonewall Brigade Band serenades the city from this bandstand. Just behind that bandstand lies a railroad. Not a full-sized railroad, but a small miniature train that for years has given rides to the children and people of the area. Sadly, for years, it sat in its dark barn and deteriorated. It was almost taken to the scrap heap and destroyed. This is the true story of how the children, parents, and grandparents of Staunton, Virginia, rescued that little train and literally brought it back to life. The miniature train company began building small trains for amusement parks back in 1935. By World War II, it had many of its popular 12-inch gauge trains running in department stores and amusement parks around the country. The larger Gypsy Express train, number 732, is the 232nd G16 train built. In 1957, Staunton Moose Lodge, number 1635, received permission from the Staunton City Council to operate a miniature train in Gypsy Hill Park. The train was sponsored by the lodge and owned and operated by George and Linda Bartley. The Bartleys moved the train to the park and maintained and ran it for 33 years until 1991. When they decided they could no longer operate the train, the Bartleys sold it to the city in 1992. Staunton City Parks and Recreation Department operated the train from 1992 to 1998, when it was shut down and considered unsafe to operate. Repair estimates were prohibitive, and the city considered getting rid of the little train. But the people of Staunton were not about to let that happen. On August 7, 2000, John Zinn, a local train enthusiast, called for a public meeting to discuss saving the little train.
You know, all of a sudden, all this thing hit the paper, the train's unsafe, and I won't let my children ride, and all that thing going. City council discussing it, and then to talk about, well, if it's unsafe, we're going to junk it. Well, trains are not unsafe. If you don't take care of them, they can become unsafe. So I went to one of the city council work sessions and asked them what was going on, and they had reports and they had studies, and I just said, well, would you give me 30 days to see if there's any interest in doing something about it? And they said, all right. So we got paper, put an announcement in that we were going to meet and talk about, you know, what can be done with the train. Is it dangerous? It doesn't need to be junked, etc. And I did know there were very few of them left in the country, but that night we had about 50 people show up, and when I looked at that room, I knew we were home free. We could do it.
The first task was to assess what they had to do. For some members, this was their first glimpse of the train. After 40 years of operation, the train had sat for over 3 years without any attention. Flooding was a problem since the track and station sat next to a creek. Track ballast had to be replaced. Ties lay rotting. The rails were badly out of gauge. The bridges were not safe. The train barn was badly rotted. In other words, a lot of work was needed. So 4 teams of people got to work. The fundraising team canvassed the city for donations. The engine team set about refurbishing the train. The track team needed to replace all the track and even relocate some of the sections. And the building and grounds team went to work refurbishing and replacing all the structures, even the bridges. The goal was to have the little train back in operation by the following 4th of July. That was just 8 months away. But when all began their jobs, nobody looked back. In November 2000, the engine team started by moving the train to a donated warehouse for refurbishing and painting. A ramp was tried first, but the ramp was too steep. Finally, moving the truck bed almost even with the track, the 1-ton engine was moved onto the truck using carefully designed wooden rails fastened to a plywood base. Another set of wooden rails was prepared for the warehouse. It was now time to move the little train from its home of 42 years. At the warehouse, the engine manifold covers were removed, only to reveal rat nests underneath. The electrical wiring was useless. But the team persisted. The engine and cars were cleaned and refurbished, all brake pads and brake cylinders replaced, and the electrical system was rebuilt. One member even located an identical engine in a nearby town that could be used as a backup if the original engine would not run.
There's a southern train leaving here this morning. It's heading south at 10:49.
Members of the track team were busy laying out where the new rail bed could be placed, and the building and grounds team looked to a new station and bridge locations. Because of the possibility of flooding, it would be necessary to move the rail bed and station to higher ground. Surveys were completed, curves computed, and a new station staked out. A new final design was agreed upon. As rail screws and plates were removed, the welded 8-pound rail had to be cut into lengths and stored. These were later sold to a private train operation in North Carolina. The rotted ties were then lifted and piled for disposal, and the old rail bed came up and was disposed of. 110 tons of fill dirt and 518 tons of stone were added to lengthen and move the roadbed up the hill. Drains were added underneath.
Look yonder coming.
Brand new 30-foot, 12-pound rail sections, each weighing 120 pounds, were brought in. Donated lumber for the ties was cut and painted. "598 new and larger ties, spaced 18 inches apart, were each placed by the volunteer crew. New plates, bolts, connecting plates, and spikes were designed and delivered. In the meantime, the members made gauging tools for the 16-inch track. And even an antique rail bender was located for loan from the Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad Museum in Portland, Maine. The antique rail bender went to work hand bending each section of rail into position. Over 2,000 new hand-driven spikes and custom-designed tie plates held the rails together at the proper gauge.
all the time. He made the freight train boogie as he rolled down the line.
In early 2001, the station house was moved to higher ground and refurbished. New roof, new siding, and new gutters and downspouts were installed. Storage space was added, even the floor carpeted. Benches were repaired and painted, and new sidewalks and an expanded loading platform were added, and new signs made for the station area. Volunteerism at work again. 2 new bridges were designed and built over the creek. After surveying and staking the locations, concrete footings were poured, concrete and wood abutments built on the footings, and large steel I-beams installed to span the creek. Ties were bolted to the I-beams and track, with derailleurs laid. Pratt-designed through-truss bridges reversed the slope of the diagonal members, placing the diagonals in tension and the posts in compression. The cars and engine were transported from the warehouse to Valley Tech School so students could perform the needed body work. They then applied a primer coat. All 52 of the old windows were replaced, right down to the 8 rivets for each one. Later, miniature horn, ladders, and other parts were found. They were purchased and added to complete the train. Finally, the revolving light mechanisms for the engine and the rear car were rebuilt with newly machined parts. Once again, the cars and engine returned to the warehouse and were painted in the red and yellow colors of the Santa Fe Railroad's Super Chief. And the newly designed Gypsy Express logo was added on the front.
She came down to Birmingham one cold December day. As she pulled into the station, you could hear all the people say, "There's a girl from Tennessee, she's long and she's tall. She came down to Birmingham on the Hall-Pass Cannonball."
Finally, enough track was laid that the train could return to the park. Since the loaded truck would be too heavy to cross the new rail, they devised and built a steel frame so a forklift could lift the cars off the truck and onto the track.
Push your back end in.
The engine was started and tested on the new track for the first time. And in a miniature recreation of another historic event, a golden spike was driven at the lower bridge where the last 2 rail sections met.
Well, this is a railroad. Before it was a toy. And these things are not toys. If you ride on them, they're not a toy. It's a railroad. It's just smaller. And we built it to the best standards we could do, and it just came together. But there was a lot of people involved. I expect we didn't keep good records, but I imagine there's about 200 at least involved in it.
To complete the picture, landscaping was added, trees planted, a new flagpole, fencing, and gates were installed. Training sessions for train engineers, ticket takers, and merchandise sellers took a while, but by August 4th, everybody knew it was time. And what better way to celebrate than with a picnic for all the volunteers and donors?
Well, I've been all around my old hometown. I have
The renewed Gypsy Express began formal operation August 5th, 2001. A formal program was planned for the rededication, but Mother Nature wanted to have a say. A downpour started just as the train began to leave the barn. But the rain did not deter the people. They stood in line in the rain waiting to ride. And perhaps to demonstrate the quality of all the work, as the creek began to rise, the track stayed firm and proud and high above the water. And then the sun came out. Bartley Station was back in business. The work was not completely finished yet. The train barn was replaced with a replica of the 1917 C&O train barn in Fraser's Bottom, West Virginia. The upper bridge was eventually made into a single Burr arch covered bridge. It's a replica of the 1884 Pine Grove Bridge near Chester County, Pennsylvania. The two arched beams on the inside were made by bending and laminating a series of long planks. When finished, they were bolted to the side trusses. Doors were installed on each end so the spare car could be stored there during winter months. Volunteers then set about designing and building a third car to accommodate larger people and those with disabilities, including wheelchairs. An old car was found and purchased in Illinois, and that became the base for the new car. On June 28, 2003, the car was dedicated to honor Augusta County's Mary Ann Cachette, an inspiration to the community of people with disabilities and a member of the National Hall of Fame for persons with disabilities. And a large sign was designed and installed near the station to explain the train's history. At the beginning, we called this a love story, and it is. Truly, the Gypsy Express could not exist without the many thousands of hours of volunteer help from the community, as well as contributions from individuals and businesses. So why do they do it? Well, come for yourself and ride the train. Watch the expressions of the people of all ages as they ride the train. See the kids' faces. Look at the train park, how it glistens and shines just like it must have when it was first built back in 1958. This is truly a work of the heart. Americans in action for their community.